After spending 3 years caring for my paralyzed wife, I overheard her calling me her servant, so I walked away. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Before we begin today's story, I'd like to ask for a small favor. If stories about love, sacrifice, betrayal, and second chances resonate with you, please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss a new upload. Your support means more than you know, and it helps us continue bringing powerful, unforgettable stories to life. We'd also love to know where you're watching from. So take a moment to leave your city or country in the comments below and join our growing community from around the world. Thank you for being here. Now, let's return to our story. The cruelest betrayals are never shouted across a room. They're whispered just loudly enough for the wrong person to hear. Malcolm Brooks stood motionless in the hallway, one hand still wrapped around the warm ceramic mug of herbal tea he had prepared exactly the way Vanessa liked it every single morning for the past 3 years. Steam drifted lazily toward the ceiling while laughter floated through the half-open bedroom door. It wasn't the laughter that stopped his heart. It was the sentence that followed. Honestly, he's not even my husband anymore. He's basically my servant. Another woman laughed through the phone speaker, and Vanessa laughed with her, light and effortless, as if those words weighed nothing at all. Malcolm didn't breathe. He didn't step into the room. He didn't interrupt. He simply stood there, staring at the pale sunlight stretching across the hardwood floor, wondering how 3 years of love could disappear inside one careless sentence. Just minutes earlier, his morning had looked exactly like every other morning since the accident. His alarm had sounded at 5:30 a.m. He had quietly slipped out of bed, brewed fresh coffee for himself, warmed oatmeal for Vanessa, organized her medications into the small white container marked with each day of the week, and checked the weather before opening the curtains just enough to let gentle light fill their home. Every movement had become second nature. Every routine was memorized. Every sacrifice had blended into ordinary life. Friends used to tell him he was remarkable, but Malcolm never believed them. To him, marriage had never been about convenience. It had been about staying when staying became difficult. 3 years earlier, when doctors explained that Vanessa's recovery would be uncertain and painfully slow, people expected him to break. Some quietly assumed he would leave. Others suggested hiring full-time care so he could reclaim his own life. Malcolm ignored every suggestion. He reduced his work hours, emptied his savings without complaint, learned physical therapy exercises from specialists, memorized medication schedules, mastered recipes that matched her changing diet, and celebrated every tiny improvement like it was the greatest victory on earth. The first time Vanessa managed to lift her own hand after months of rehabilitation, Malcolm cried in the hospital parking lot where no one could see him. He never told her. He believed love wasn't measured by grand speeches. It was measured in ordinary mornings, in sleepless nights, in silent promises kept long after the applause disappeared. Somewhere along the way, though, he had stopped asking himself one important question. Was his devotion still being received as love, or had it quietly become expectation? Standing outside that bedroom door, he suddenly replayed hundreds of moments that once seemed harmless. The impatient sighs when breakfast arrived 2 minutes late. The casual orders instead of requests. The absent thank yous. The growing distance in her eyes whenever he smiled at her, hoping for even the smallest glimpse of the woman he had married. He had explained each one away. Trauma changes people, he reminded himself. Healing takes time. Be patient. Love harder. Give more. Yet now those scattered memories fit together like pieces of a picture he had refused to see. The mug in his hand had begun to cool, but Malcolm barely noticed. Inside the room, Vanessa was still talking, still laughing, completely unaware that the man who had rebuilt his entire life around her had heard every single word. And for the very first time in 3 long years, Malcolm realized that the heaviest burden he had been carrying wasn't the responsibility of caring for his wife. It was the quiet belief that if he just loved her enough, she would eventually remember to love him back. Malcolm quietly set the untouched mug on the hallway table before the tea had a chance to grow cold. His fingers lingered on the handle for a moment, not because he expected the warmth to comfort him, but because he needed something steady while everything inside him threatened to come apart. The conversation continued behind the bedroom door as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Vanessa thanked her friend for making her laugh. They chatted about television shows, neighborhood gossip, and the weather outside. To anyone else, it sounded like an ordinary phone call. To Malcolm, every casual word became another reminder that the person he had devoted his life to no longer saw him as the man who had promised forever. She saw him as someone whose presence had become as ordinary as the furniture around her. He turned around without making a sound and walked toward the kitchen. The house looked exactly as it had every morning for years. The refrigerator was covered with appointment reminders from physical therapists, grocery lists, and handwritten notes reminding him when prescriptions needed refilling. The calendar hanging near the pantry was filled with medical visits instead of birthdays or vacations. On the counter rested a binder nearly 4 inches thick, containing insurance paperwork, rehabilitation exercises, emergency contacts, and carefully organized medical records. Malcolm had built his entire world around helping Vanessa heal. Somewhere along the way, he had quietly disappeared from the picture. He poured the tea into the sink and watched it swirl down the drain. It was such an ordinary sight, yet it felt strangely symbolic. For years he had poured every ounce of energy into someone else without asking whether anything was flowing back toward him. He leaned against the counter and closed his eyes. Memories began arriving one after another, not as dramatic moments, but as tiny scenes he had ignored. The anniversary dinner that never happened because Vanessa did not feel like celebrating. The birthday gift that remained unopened for weeks because therapy had left her tired. The evenings when he sat beside her reading aloud from her favorite novels while she scrolled silently through her phone instead of listening. Each memory had come with an explanation at the time. She is exhausted. She is grieving the life she lost. Be patient. But patience had slowly transformed into permission. Love had quietly become obligation. A few minutes later, he heard the familiar sound of Vanessa calling his name. Malcolm. Her voice carried through the hallway with the same expectation it always had. Can you help me with my blanket? He stood perfectly still. It was the first time in 3 years that he did not answer immediately. She called again, slightly louder this time. There was no anger in her voice, only certainty that he would appear because he always did. Malcolm finally walked back toward the bedroom, opened the door with a calm expression, and adjusted the blanket over her legs without mentioning what he had overheard. Vanessa smiled politely, thanked him absent-mindedly, and returned to looking at her phone. She never searched his face closely enough to notice that something fundamental had changed. As Malcolm stepped back into the hallway, he realized the silence between them no longer felt peaceful. It felt final. For 3 years, he had believed endurance was the highest form of love. Standing alone outside that room once again, he began to wonder whether true love also required enough self-respect to recognize the exact moment when devotion stopped being appreciated and quietly started being taken for granted. Malcolm did not sleep that night. The house was unusually quiet, yet every familiar sound seemed louder than ever before. The refrigerator hummed softly in the kitchen. The old grandfather clock in the living room marked each passing minute with calm certainty. Rain tapped gently against the windows, washing the streets outside while his thoughts refused to settle. He sat alone at the dining table where they had once shared takeout dinners after long workdays, before hospital visits replaced date. Nights and medical schedules replaced weekend plans. His eyes drifted toward a framed photograph resting on the shelf nearby. It had been taken 5 years earlier during a summer trip to Charleston. Vanessa was laughing as ocean wind carried her hair across her face, and Malcolm was looking at her instead of the camera. The photographer had joked that he should smile for the picture, but Malcolm had answered that he already was. Looking back now, he realized that moment had been one of the last times love felt effortless. The accident changed everything in a single afternoon, but it did not change his decision. He still remembered sitting beside Vanessa's hospital bed while machines quietly monitored her condition. The doctors spoke carefully, explaining that recovery would require patience, determination, and years of rehabilitation. They could not promise how much mobility she would regain or how long the process might take. Malcolm never asked whether it would be difficult. He asked only one question: what does she need? That answer became the blueprint for the next 3 years of his life. He learned how to safely transfer her from bed to wheelchair without causing discomfort. He studied nutrition plans recommended by specialists. He watched instructional videos late into the night to improve the stretching exercises that helped maintain her strength. He filled notebooks with medication schedules and therapy milestones. Every tiny victory became a celebration. The first time Vanessa managed to hold a coffee mug by herself for several seconds, Malcolm applauded as though she had won an Olympic medal. When she laughed in frustration after dropping it again, he laughed with her, hoping she would never feel embarrassed in front of him. He quietly declined promotions at work because they required travel. He sold his vintage motorcycle to cover treatment costs insurance refused to pay. He missed family reunions, fishing trips with old friends, and countless invitations because someone always needed to be home with Vanessa. Not once did he keep score. Not once did he ask what life might have looked like if he had chosen differently. Love was never a transaction. In his heart, it was a commitment renewed every morning before sunrise. Yet somewhere inside those years, the balance between giving and receiving slowly disappeared. Vanessa rarely asked about his day anymore. She no longer noticed the dark circles beneath his eyes after sleepless nights. Holidays became ordinary Tuesdays. Anniversaries quietly passed without mention. Malcolm convinced himself that healing demanded sacrifice, and perhaps it did. But sacrifice without gratitude slowly transformed into loneliness. As dawn finally began to brighten the horizon, pale light crept across the dining room floor exactly as it had every morning before. Malcolm looked around the house that had become more like a rehabilitation center than a home, and for the first time he allowed himself to admit something he had spent years refusing to believe. The woman he had fought beside every single day was recovering from her physical injuries. But somewhere along that journey, their marriage had quietly stopped recovering at all. And with that painful realization came another one, just as undeniable. If nothing changed, he would spend the rest of his life caring for someone who no longer saw the man standing beside her, only the service he continued to provide. When the sun rose the next morning, Malcolm followed the same routine his body had memorized over 3 long years, but this time his heart no longer believed it belonged there. He prepared breakfast with the same careful attention, stirred the oatmeal until it reached the texture Vanessa preferred, sliced fresh strawberries into perfect pieces, and placed her morning medication beside a glass of water. Every movement was steady, almost peaceful, as though he had already accepted a truth that had spent the entire night settling inside him. There was no anger left to fuel him, only clarity. He carried the tray into the bedroom and greeted Vanessa with the same gentle smile she had seen countless mornings before. She barely looked up from the tablet resting on her lap. "Good morning," she replied absent-mindedly before asking whether the physical therapist had confirmed the afternoon appointment. Malcolm answered quietly that everything had already been arranged. She nodded without another word and reached for her breakfast. As she ate, she casually mentioned that the laundry detergent was running low and reminded him to pick some up later. Then she asked whether he had mailed an insurance form that had arrived 2 days earlier. Her requests were ordinary, almost harmless on their own. Yet Malcolm noticed something he had overlooked for years. There was never a question about how he was feeling, never curiosity about whether he was tired, never concern for the man who made every detail of her day possible. He listened patiently, responding with calm politeness, while silently realizing that their conversations had become lists of responsibilities instead of moments shared between husband and wife. After breakfast, Malcolm helped Vanessa begin her morning stretches exactly as the therapist had taught them. He counted each movement aloud with the same encouraging voice he had always used. She completed several exercises with more strength than she had shown only months before. He sincerely congratulated her progress, and for a brief second she smiled with genuine pride. It reminded him of the woman he had once fallen in love with, and for one dangerous moment, he almost convinced himself to forget everything he had heard. But memories no longer allowed themselves to be buried. The laughter from the previous morning echoed through his mind with painful clarity, followed by the single word that had changed everything. Servant. That word had quietly separated love from obligation forever. Later that afternoon, while Vanessa rested after therapy, Malcolm walked into the small home office he had not truly used in years. He opened an old drawer and found the leather portfolio that had collected dust since he reduced his career to part-time. Inside rested certificates, recommendation letters, and a resume that belonged to a version of himself he barely recognized. He stared at his own name printed neatly across the top of the page. Malcolm Brooks. For the first time in years, it looked less like a caregiver's name and more like the identity of a man who still had a future waiting beyond the walls of this house. He sat at the desk and pulled out a blank sheet of paper. The room remained perfectly silent except for the scratching of his pen. He did not write accusations. He did not list sacrifices or disappointments. He simply began putting into words what he had finally accepted after 3 years of giving everything he had. Some departures begin with slammed doors and raised voices. Others begin with a single sheet of paper, written by someone who has discovered that protecting their own dignity is not an act of abandonment, but the first honest act of self-respect they have allowed themselves in far too long. Malcolm folded the letter with slow, deliberate care and placed it inside a plain white envelope. He wrote only Vanessa's name on the front before setting it beside the neatly organized binder that contained every detail of her medical care. The pages inside represented thousands of hours of learning, planning, and remembering, but they also represented the life he had quietly surrendered piece by piece. Before leaving the office, he updated the final page with the contact information for a licensed home health agency he had already spoken with the previous afternoon. He had not made this decision impulsively. He refused to disappear without making certain Vanessa would continue receiving the support she needed. Love, even after heartbreak, did not allow him to abandon his values. The following morning unfolded with almost painful familiarity. Malcolm prepared breakfast, assisted with Vanessa's exercises, and drove her to physical therapy as scheduled. The waiting room smelled of fresh coffee and disinfectant, just as it always had. Nurses greeted Malcolm by name because they had seen him there week after week for years. One therapist smiled and remarked that Vanessa had made remarkable progress because of his dedication. Malcolm thanked her politely, but the compliment settled differently than it once had. Instead of pride, he felt a quiet sadness. So many strangers had recognized his devotion, while the person closest to him had stopped seeing it altogether. During Vanessa's therapy session, Malcolm walked outside and sat alone on a wooden bench overlooking a small garden beside the rehabilitation center. Families passed by carrying flowers, balloons, and paper bags filled with lunch. Some laughed together. Others spoke in hushed voices about appointments and recovery plans. Malcolm realized he had spent so long living one day at a time that he had forgotten to imagine a future for himself. He closed his eyes and tried to remember what brought him joy before hospitals and insurance claims became his entire world. He remembered early morning runs through the neighborhood, weekend photography trips with friends, listening to jazz while cooking dinner simply because he enjoyed it, not because someone needed a carefully measured meal. Those memories did not belong to another lifetime. They belonged to the man he still was beneath years of exhaustion. That afternoon, after they returned home, Malcolm carefully stocked the refrigerator, labeled medications for the next several weeks, and organized every drawer exactly the way visiting caregivers would need them. He tested emergency phone numbers one last time and left detailed notes explaining Vanessa's daily routine, favorite meals, therapy schedule, and small comforts that made difficult days easier. He knew where she preferred to keep an extra blanket. He knew which music helped her relax before bed. He even remembered the brand of herbal tea she insisted tasted better than every other kind. None of those details had been forgotten. They had simply become part of a goodbye she would not yet recognize. As evening settled over the house, golden light filtered through the living room windows, wrapping familiar furniture in a gentle glow. Malcolm stood quietly in the hallway, looking at the home they had built together. There had been birthdays celebrated here, dreams discussed late into the night, and promises exchanged with complete sincerity. He did not hate those memories. He cherished them enough to understand they deserved a different ending than resentment. He picked up his overnight bag, no larger than one used for a weekend trip, because there was very little left that truly belonged to him. Before reaching the front door, he placed the envelope where Vanessa could not possibly miss it. Then he rested his hand on the doorknob for one final moment. The hardest part was not walking away from the house. The hardest part was accepting that he had already been leaving in silence for much longer than either of them had realized. Vanessa did not notice the silence until the next morning. She woke expecting to hear familiar footsteps moving through the kitchen before sunrise, expecting the gentle knock on her bedroom door, followed by Malcolm's calm voice asking whether she had slept well. Instead, the house remained perfectly still. She waited another minute, then another 5. Finally, she reached for her phone and called his name from the bedroom. There was no answer. Assuming he had stepped outside, she glanced toward the hallway, but the front door remained closed. A strange feeling settled into the room, quiet at first, almost impossible to describe. It was not fear. It was the unsettling realization that routine had suddenly disappeared. Vanessa reached for the bedside table and noticed the white envelope resting beside the medical binder Malcolm always kept nearby. Her name was written across the front in his familiar handwriting. She opened it slowly, expecting another reminder about appointments or prescriptions. Instead, she found a simple letter. Malcolm thanked her for the years they had shared before life changed them both. He explained that professional caregivers had already been arranged, insurance information had been updated, emergency contacts had been confirmed, and every detail necessary for her continued recovery had been carefully prepared. He wrote that he genuinely hoped she would regain her independence and live the full life she deserved. Then came the sentence that refused to leave her mind. I can continue helping you heal, or I can begin healing myself. I no longer have the strength to do both. There were no accusations. No mention of the phone call. No attempt to make her feel guilty. Only honesty wrapped in kindness. Vanessa folded the letter with trembling hands and looked around the bedroom. For the first time in years, every object seemed unfamiliar. The neatly organized medications, the fresh towels folded exactly the way Malcolm always arranged them, the therapy schedule pinned to the wall, even the breakfast tray that never arrived that morning all reminded her of someone whose presence had become invisible simply because it had never failed her before. Less than an hour later, the home health nurse Malcolm had arranged arrived exactly on schedule. She introduced herself warmly, reviewed the care plan, and complimented how thoroughly everything had been organized. Your husband prepared the most detailed notes I have ever received, she said with genuine admiration. He thought of everything. Vanessa forced a polite smile, but those words settled heavily inside her. Throughout the day, she discovered how many things Malcolm had quietly handled without ever mentioning them. The nurse asked where extra linens were stored. Vanessa did not know. A pharmacy called to confirm medication refills. Malcolm had always answered those calls. The physical therapist arrived and asked about adjustments Malcolm usually made before each exercise session. Vanessa realized she had never paid attention because she had always assumed he would simply continue doing them. As evening approached, the house felt larger than it ever had before. It was not because Malcolm had taken furniture or packed away memories. He had left almost everything behind. What was missing could not be placed inside moving boxes. It was the steady presence that had quietly carried every ordinary moment for 3 years without asking for recognition. Sitting alone beside the window as sunlight slowly faded beyond the neighborhood, Vanessa unfolded the letter once more. She read the final sentence again and again, and for the first time since the accident, she wondered whether the person she believed could never leave had actually been saying goodbye long before he ever walked out the front door. The weeks that followed moved forward with a strange kind of quiet, the sort that forced every hidden truth into the open. Malcolm rented a modest one-bedroom apartment on the other side of the city, close enough to his new job, but far enough that familiar streets no longer pulled him backward. The apartment was small, with plain white walls and a single window overlooking a neighborhood park where children played every afternoon. There was no expensive furniture, no carefully decorated rooms, and no reminders of hospital appointments covering every surface. For the first time in years, the silence belonged to him instead of exhaustion. On his first Monday back to full-time work, Malcolm walked into the engineering firm where he had once been considered one of the company's brightest project managers before reducing his hours to care for Vanessa. Several former co-workers greeted him with genuine smiles, surprised but sincerely happy to see him return. His supervisor shook his hand and said, "We always hoped you would come back when the time was right." Those words stayed with Malcolm for the rest of the day because no one had expected anything from him except to simply be himself. He slowly rediscovered parts of his life that had been sleeping beneath responsibility. He started jogging again before sunrise, his lungs burning during the first few mornings after years of neglect, but each mile reminded him that healing often felt uncomfortable before it felt freeing. He dusted off the camera that had remained untouched in a closet for nearly 4 years and spent Saturday mornings photographing quiet streets, local farmers markets, and autumn leaves glowing beneath soft sunlight. He cooked dinner because he enjoyed experimenting with recipes, not because every meal needed to meet a rehabilitation schedule. None of these moments were dramatic. There were no celebrations or sudden miracles. There was only peace, arriving one ordinary day at a time. Meanwhile, Vanessa continued attending therapy with the help of professional caregivers. Physically, she kept improving, but emotionally, something had begun shifting in ways she never expected. During one appointment, her physical therapist smiled after watching her complete a difficult series of exercises. "You have made incredible progress," the therapist said. "Your husband gave you an amazing foundation. We could always tell how much work he was putting in between sessions." Vanessa lowered her eyes without answering. Later that same afternoon, one of the nurses casually mentioned how Malcolm had spent countless evenings asking detailed questions about recovery techniques so he could help more effectively at home. "Not many family members go that far," she said. "He never complained. He only wanted to make your life easier." Similar conversations followed over the next several weeks. The pharmacist remembered Malcolm by name because he never forgot prescription refill dates. The receptionist remembered how he always arrived 30 minutes early so Vanessa would never feel rushed. Even another patient quietly remarked that watching Malcolm encourage his wife during therapy had inspired him to stay hopeful during his own recovery. Piece by piece, Vanessa found herself hearing the same story from people who had no reason to exaggerate. They all described the same man: patient, gentle, faithful, tireless. She began replaying memories she had dismissed for years, and they no longer looked the way she remembered them. They looked like sacrifices she had mistaken for obligations. One evening, as she sat alone beside the living room window with Malcolm's letter resting in her lap, she finally understood something that no amount of physical rehabilitation had ever taught her. Losing the ability to walk had not been the greatest loss she suffered after the accident. The greatest loss was failing to recognize the extraordinary love that had quietly carried her every single day until the moment she convinced the man offering it that he had become nothing more than a servant in his own home. Nearly 6 months passed before their paths crossed again. It happened on a crisp Saturday morning at the rehabilitation center where so much of their shared life had once unfolded. Malcolm had returned only because one of his former therapists had invited him to speak with families who were just beginning the difficult journey of caring for loved ones. He almost declined the invitation, worried that stepping back into those familiar hallways might reopen wounds that had finally begun to heal. Instead, he accepted, believing that if his experience could ease someone else's burden, then those difficult years had not been wasted. After finishing the small gathering, he thanked the staff and quietly walked toward the front entrance carrying his camera over one shoulder. The building looked exactly as he remembered it, yet he felt completely different walking through its doors. His shoulders were no longer weighed down by endless responsibility. His smile appeared naturally instead of out of obligation. As he reached the lobby, he heard a voice softly speak his name. "Malcolm." He turned slowly. Vanessa stood several feet away, supported by a lightweight cane instead of the wheelchair that had once accompanied her everywhere. Her movements remained careful, but each step reflected months of determined progress. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. There was no dramatic music, no angry confrontation, and no rush of accusations waiting to be released. There were simply two people standing face to face after living through the same years from completely different perspectives. Vanessa finally broke the silence. "You look happy." Malcolm smiled gently. "I have found some peace." His answer carried no pride and no bitterness. It was simply true. Vanessa lowered her eyes before looking back at him with quiet sincerity. "I read your letter more times than I can count," she admitted. "At first I thought you had abandoned me. Then I realized you had been disappearing long before you left, and I never noticed." Malcolm listened without interrupting. He had imagined this conversation many times, but now that it had arrived, he discovered he no longer needed explanations to feel complete. Vanessa took a slow breath. "I owe you an apology that is probably years too late. I forgot who you were. I stopped seeing my husband and only saw the things you did for me. I cannot change that, but I needed you to know that I finally understand." Malcolm looked at the woman he had once promised forever. He saw the strength she had fought to rebuild, the regret she now carried, and the honesty in her eyes that had been missing for so long. He also recognized something inside himself that had quietly changed. The pain was gone. In Its place remained compassion, but compassion no longer demanded sacrifice. "Thank you for telling me," he said softly. "I truly hope you continue healing." Vanessa hesitated before asking the question she had carried for months. "Is there any chance we could start over?" Malcolm's expression remained kind, but his answer came without uncertainty. "I have forgiven you," he said. "Forgiveness gave me my life back. But going back would mean becoming the man who forgot his own worth, and I cannot do that again." Tears gathered in Vanessa's eyes, not because his words were cruel, but because they were spoken with complete gentleness. For the first time, she understood that love could end without hatred, and that sometimes the strongest boundary was drawn by someone who still wished you well while quietly choosing a different future for himself. Malcolm stepped out of the rehabilitation center and into the cool afternoon sunlight without looking back. The breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass from the small park across the street, and somewhere in the distance children laughed while chasing one another across an open field. Life continued exactly as it always had, indifferent to endings and beginnings, quietly reminding everyone that time never stopped for broken hearts. Malcolm paused beside his car and took one slow breath. Months earlier, he would have climbed behind the wheel carrying the invisible weight of guilt, wondering whether choosing himself had somehow made him selfish. That burden no longer existed. In its place lived something far gentler: acceptance. He started the engine and drove toward the apartment that had once felt temporary but had slowly become home. Along the way, he stopped at a neighborhood bakery where the owner greeted him by name and asked whether he planned to bring his camera to the community art festival the following weekend. Malcolm smiled and promised he would. It was such a simple conversation, yet moments like these had quietly stitched his new life together. He was no longer introduced as someone's caregiver before being recognized as himself. He was simply Malcolm, a man rebuilding an ordinary life one peaceful day after another. Across town, Vanessa remained seated near the rehabilitation center entrance long after Malcolm had disappeared from sight. She held her cane with both hands and watched strangers come and go, each carrying their own hopes, worries, and unfinished stories. For the first time since the accident, she understood that recovery was not measured only by stronger muscles or steadier steps. Some wounds could not be treated inside a therapy room. They required humility, gratitude, and the courage to face the consequences of words that could never be taken back. She returned home that evening and slowly walked through each room. Nothing had changed inside the house, yet everything felt different because she finally noticed the countless expressions of love Malcolm had quietly left behind. The carefully labeled storage containers in the pantry, the emergency numbers taped inside the kitchen cabinet, the handwritten notes explaining small details only someone paying close attention would know. Every corner of the house carried evidence of devotion she had mistaken for routine. Instead of hiding the letter Malcolm had written, Vanessa placed it inside the same photo album that held pictures from the happiest years of their marriage. She decided it belonged there because it was part of their story, not the ending she wanted, but the one they had earned through choices neither of them could undo. As seasons continued to change, Malcolm's life expanded in quiet, meaningful ways. He accepted a leadership position at work, volunteered once a month to mentor family caregivers beginning journeys similar to the one he had survived, and filled the walls of his apartment with photographs capturing ordinary people finding joy in ordinary moments. He no longer chased extraordinary happiness because he had learned that peace was enough. On certain evenings he still thought about Vanessa, not with bitterness or regret, but with sincere hope that she would continue healing and discover the same peace for herself. Some loves are meant to last forever. Others exist to teach us who we become when everything familiar falls apart. Malcolm never stopped believing the vows he made. Years earlier, he simply learned that honoring another person should never require abandoning yourself. Walking away had never been about revenge. It had never been about proving anyone wrong. It was about remembering that dignity grows quietly. Forgiveness sets the heart free. And sometimes the greatest act of love is not convincing someone to see your worth, but finally seeing it yourself before taking the first peaceful step toward a life where you never have to ask anyone else to recognize it again.